business class cabin is a sanctuary of silence, bathed in a soft, amber glow. The cabin door seals shut. In seat 3C, Caleb Morgan, a single dad, sits with his 7-year-old daughter, Ivy, fast asleep on his shoulder. Suddenly, a cold shadow falls over them. Vanessa Reed, a billionaire CEO in a designer suit, stands there, eyes flashing like steel. Her face turns pale with rage as she screams, "Get out of my seat! You don't belong here!" Every eye turns. The attendant freezes. Caleb doesn't move. He leans in, whispers one quiet sentence, and the room goes deathly silent. His name is Caleb Morgan, 45 years old, a man whose presence is as sturdy and quiet as an old oak tree in a winter storm. To the wealthy travelers in the business class cabin, the tech giants and the hedge fund managers, he looks like an interloper, a ghost from a world they tried to forget. Caleb is wearing an old, faded canvas jacket that smells faintly of cedar and rain. His boots are clean, but the soles are worn thin from years of walking paths they wouldn't dare touch. His hands are thick and scarred, telling a wordless story of hard, physical labor under a sun that doesn't care about stock prices. He doesn't carry a leather briefcase or wear a $5,000 watch. He only carries the fragile weight of a sleeping child. The boarding process had been a blur of fluorescent lights and sharp voices. Caleb had spent the last 3 hours pacing the rainy terminal, trying to keep Ivy calm as the realization of their loss began to sink into her small heart. The rain outside the terminal windows had been a relentless, gray curtain, a mirror to the gloom settled in Caleb's bones. Every step toward the gate felt like walking through deep water, his muscles aching with the physical manifestation of a psychological load. When the gate agent announced the overbooked flight and called his name for an upgrade, he didn't feel lucky. He felt exposed. He knew that stepping into the front of the plane meant stepping into a world of judgment. But the lure of a quiet, wide seat where Ivy could finally rest was too strong to refuse. In his arms, 7-year-old Ivy is a dead weight, her small chest rising and falling in the deep, rhythmic sleep of total emotional exhaustion. She had cried herself to sleep at the boarding gate, her tiny face streaked with dried salt and her eyes swollen from a grief too big for her body. They were traveling across the country for a funeral, a journey Caleb never wanted to take. The tickets were a last-minute necessity, a desperate scramble to reach the coast before the final goodbye. Caleb didn't care about the extra legroom, the noise-canceling headphones, or the free champagne. He only cared that Ivy could finally, for a few hours, stop crying and find a sanctuary in her dreams. Caleb is a man who spent his youth in high-pressure environments, a former crisis negotiator who used to navigate the darkest corners of human chaos for a living. He had stood on bridge ledges and in the middle of bank heists, using his voice to pull people back from the edge. He knows the sound of a voice about to break. He knows the look of a person who thinks power is a substitute for peace. But today, he chooses the margins. He avoids eye contact. He speaks in hushed tones, and he tries to make himself as small as possible in a seat that feels too big for his life. He knows he doesn't look the part of a business class passenger, and he is used to the sideways glances and the subtle, judgmental whispers. He just wants the cabin lights to dim so he can disappear into the night and hold his daughter through the turbulence. Vanessa Reed is the reason he can't disappear. At 42, she is the CEO of one of the most aggressive real estate empires in the city. A woman who moves through life like a hurricane in a glass house. She is a woman who is used to being obeyed. A woman who has forgotten what the word no feels like. Today, Vanessa is on a razor's edge. She has just come from a grueling week of hostile takeovers. Her nerves are frayed to the point of snapping, and her patience is a cold, empty well. Her phone is buzzing with messages from lawyers. Her heart is racing from too much caffeine and not enough sleep, and her ego is a wounded animal looking for a target. To Vanessa, seat 3C isn't just a place to sit. It is her territory. It is the seat she always books, the seat that represents her status, her control, and her right to be above the rest. It is her fortress against a world that is currently trying to tear her empire down. As she strides down the aisle, her designer heels clicking sharply, almost violently, against the carpeted floor, she sees Caleb. She sees the old jacket. She sees the matted hair of the child. And in her tired, power-hungry mind, she doesn't see a father and a daughter. She sees a mistake. She sees an insult to the prestige she has spent 20 years building. She assumes that a low-level employee made a massive error in the manifest. She sees someone who belongs in the back, taking up her space, breathing her air. The friction between her exhaustion and her entitlement is a ticking bomb, and as she stops at row 3, the fuse is finally lit. Vanessa doesn't wait for an explanation. She doesn't ask politely or check her pass a second time. She points a manicured finger at Caleb, her hand trembling with a mix of raw fatigue and unadulterated fury. "Get out of my seat! Get out! Right now! This isn't a charity ward." The sound is like a gunshot in the quiet, pressurized cabin. Ivy jolts in her sleep, her small body shivering as she lets out a tiny, whimpering gasp that cuts Caleb to the bone. He immediately places a large, protective hand on her back, drawing her closer, shielding her face with his jacket. He feels her heart racing like a trapped bird against his chest, and for a second, a flash of the old fire, the cold, deadly focus of a man who once stared down monsters, burns in his eyes. But he keeps his voice low. He keeps it steady. "Ma'am, please," Caleb says, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "You're waking my daughter. Lower your voice." Vanessa scoffs, her face turning a deep, ugly shade of crimson. She feels the eyes of the other passengers on her, the men in suits who look like her, and she feels she has to win this battle. "I don't care about your daughter. I care about my seat. I have paid for this ticket. I fly this route every week. You are in the wrong place. You are an interloper, and you need to move to the back where you belong. Marcus, get over here and do your job." A flight attendant, a young man named Marcus who has worked this cabin for 3 years, rushes over, his hands raised in a desperate, calming gesture. Marcus felt the sweat pooling at the collar of his uniform. He had handled drunken athletes and demanding celebrities, but there was a volatility in Vanessa Reed that felt like a localized weather system. She was a woman who lived in the now, and any delay was a personal affront to her perceived timeline of the universe. "Is there a problem here? Ms. Reed, please." "We're getting ready for pushback. The captain needs the aisles clear." Vanessa doesn't even look at Marcus. She keeps her eyes locked on Caleb, her lip curled in a sneer of pure, unmitigated contempt. There is no need for pass checking. Look at him. Does he look like a 3C passenger? This is clearly a computer error or a case of someone letting a vagrant into the vault. I want him moved. I want him gone. And I want it done before the cabin doors are locked. I will not sit in 2A like an afterthought when I book 3C. The other passengers are whispering now, the sound like dry leaves blowing across a graveyard. A man in 4D leans forward, murmuring to his wife about the quality of the service going downhill. Caleb reaches into the pocket of his jacket with his free hand, slowly, deliberately, pulling out a crumpled, thermal-printed boarding pass. He hands it to Marcus. The attendant looks at it, his eyes widening. Then he looks at his tablet, then back at the pass. "Ma'am," Marcus says softly, his voice now carrying a weight that Vanessa doesn't recognize. "Mr. Morgan is in the correct seat. He was upgraded by the ground supervisor due to an overbooked flight. Seat 3C is his for the duration of this journey. 2A has been reassigned to you. It's a bulkhead seat with extra privacy." Vanessa lets out a harsh, dry laugh that sounds like breaking glass. "I don't believe you. I've been a Diamond executive for 10 years. My seat is 3C. I don't care if the computer made a mistake. I'm not sitting anywhere else. Move them. Take them to economy. Give them a voucher. Just get them out of my sight before I call your corporate office." Caleb takes a deep, slow breath. He feels Ivy's tears starting to soak through his shirt. She is awake now, her eyes wide and filled with the terror of a child who thinks she's in trouble. Caleb looks at Vanessa, and for the first time, he really sees her. He sees the panic behind her expensive makeup, the desperation behind her heavy jewelry. He sees a woman who has equated her worth with a coordinate on a plane. He knows that if he fights her, if he screams back, Ivy will never stop crying. He leans forward, his eyes fixed on Vanessa's with a gaze that is so intense, so heavy with truth, that she actually takes a step back. He waits for the cabin to fall silent, for the whispers to stop, for the very air to go still. Then, he speaks in a voice so small, so quiet, it almost disappears into the hum of the aircraft. He speaks one quiet sentence that cuts through Vanessa's armor like a hot blade through silk. I am just trying to take my daughter home, so she can say goodbye to her mother for the last time, before we bury her on Tuesday. Vanessa freezes, her hand, still pointing at the seat, begins to tremble. The anger drains out of her face so fast she looks like a ghost in a designer suit. The silence that follows isn't just quiet, it is heavy. It is the kind of silence that makes you hear the blood rushing in your ears. It is a silence of absolute, crushing realization that has nothing to do with airline status. The air in the cabin feels like it has been sucked out by a vacuum. The single sentence, spoken without malice, without volume, without the need for a weapon, has completely remapped the reality of the room. Caleb isn't a man stealing a seat anymore. He isn't a grease monkey in the wrong cabin. He is a man carrying the shattered pieces of a life. He is a man who is standing at the edge of the world. Vanessa stays frozen for a heartbeat too long. Her heart is hammering, but for the first time in years, it isn't from anger. It's from a sudden, violent wave of shame that tastes like iron in her mouth. She looks down at Ivy, and for the first time, she doesn't see a disruptive child. She sees the matted fur of the teddy bear the girl is clutching, its eyes worn down from years of being a silent witness to a family's joy, and now their greatest tragedy. She sees the small, pale hand gripped tightly around Caleb's thumb, as if he is the only thing keeping her from floating away into the dark. She sees the raw, jagged edges of a grief she has spent her entire career trying to bury under towers of glass and steel. Caleb leaned back into his seat, his eyes closing for a brief second. He used the techniques he had taught to dozens of rookies, the tactical breathing that slowed the pulse and narrowed the focus. He wasn't just managing the woman in front of him. He was managing the ghost of his wife in the seat next to him, a presence that felt both heavy and hollow in the recycled air of the plane. The flight attendant, Marcus, clears his throat, his voice now filled with a deep, sudden, and almost reverent respect. Miss Reed, I have seat 2A ready for you. It's a bulkhead. It's very private. I'll bring you some hot tea and a blanket. Would you like to move there now? We really must close the doors. Vanessa doesn't move. She doesn't scream. She doesn't even look at her boarding pass. She looks at Caleb, her eyes searching his face for a lie, for a trace of manipulation. But she finds nothing but a father's love and a husband's loss. I didn't know, she whispers, her voice sounding thin, cracked, and small, like a child's. Caleb just nods. He doesn't look for an apology. He doesn't want her pity. He doesn't need her to understand. He just wants the peace he promised his daughter at the terminal. He gently adjusts the blanket over Ivy's legs, his movements tender, precise, and heartbreakingly soft. He strokes her hair, leaning down to whisper that everything is okay, even though he knows it isn't. Is she going to be okay? Vanessa asks, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. It's a question she didn't mean to ask, a human bridge being built over a chasm of ego. It is the first time in 10 years she has asked about someone else's well-being without a contract in her hand. She feels an odd, painful tightening in her throat. Caleb looks up at her. She's 7, ma'am. She'll never be okay again. But she's safe tonight. That's all I have left to give her. A few hours of safety before the world demands her strength again. Vanessa feels a sharp, stinging pain in her chest, a physical weight pressing down on her lungs. She remembers being 7 years old, sitting in the back of a black car, watching her own world fall apart, while people in expensive suits talked over her head, treating her like a nuisance rather than a person. She realizes that she had become the very monster she used to fear. She realizes that her success, her empire, her seat, they are all hollow shells. She slowly turns and walks towards seat 2A. The other passengers look away as she passes, no longer in awe of her power or her status, but embarrassed for her conduct. The man in 4D suddenly finds something very interesting to read in the safety manual. Vanessa sits down, but she doesn't pull out her laptop. She doesn't check her messages. She doesn't call her office. She stares at the seat back in front of her, the roar of the engine starting up, the vibration of the plane echoing the turmoil in her soul. The cabin is quiet as the plane begins to taxi toward the runway. No one talks about the shouting woman anymore. They are all watching the man in 3C, who is now softly humming a lullaby to the little girl on his shoulder. The luxury of the cabin, the fine leather, the expensive wine. It all feels like plastic. It feels like a theater set. The only real thing in the air is the love of a father and the weight of a loss that no upgrade could ever fix. Vanessa watches them through the gap in the seats, feeling like an outsider in her own world. Vanessa closes her eyes as the plane takes off. For the first time in a decade, she isn't thinking about real estate, hostile takeovers, or stock prices. She is thinking about the man who didn't fight back, the man who used a whisper to stop a storm. She realizes that true power isn't about having the best seat. It isn't about the noise you make or the people you crush. It's about having the strength to stay quiet when the world is screaming, and the courage to be kind when you have every reason to be cruel. The flight is 3 hours in, the plane cruising through the dark, starlit sky at 30,000 feet. The cabin lights are dimmed, and most of the passengers are asleep. But Vanessa can't sleep. The silence of the cabin is louder than any board meeting she has ever chaired. She keeps looking back through the gap in the seats at Caleb and Ivy. The image of the little girl's grip on her father's hand is etched into her mind. She sees Marcus, the flight attendant, walk over with a fresh blanket and a warm bottle of water. Caleb thanks him with a tired, genuine smile. Vanessa watches as Caleb carefully uncurls Ivy's fingers from his jacket, tucking the blanket around her small frame like he's handling a piece of spun glass. He moves like a man who is afraid that if he lets go, even for a second, the world will shatter into a million pieces. Vanessa presses the call button. When Marcus arrives, she speaks in a whisper, her voice trembling with a vulnerability she hasn't felt since her youth. Marcus, I need to do something. May I? Is there anything else I can do for them? Can I pay for their transportation when we land? Can I arrange a private car or a hotel near the cemetery? Marcus looks at her, his expression neutral but soft. He sees the genuine change in her eyes. I think he just needs the silence, Ms. Reed. He told me they'd been traveling for 20 hours. But it was kind of you to ask. Truly, I'll ask him if they need a car when we land. Vanessa lets out a long, shaky breath. She leans back and looks out the window at the dark clouds below. She thinks about why she was so angry, why she felt the need to scream. She realizes she was just as tired as Ivy, just as scared as Caleb, but she had chosen to hide it behind a wall of gold. She had just come from the hospital, visiting her own father, who didn't recognize her anymore. She thought of her father's hand, once large and capable, now thin as parchment, tracing patterns in the sterile air of room 402. He had looked at her with the same vacant terror she had seen in Ivy's eyes, a look that whispered, "Help me," across a distance that no amount of money could close. She realizes that power is often just a shield we use to hide our own fragility. She had been using seat 3C as a fortress, thinking that if she could just control her environment, if she could just have everything perfect, she could control her life. But Caleb had shown her that the only thing we can truly control is how we treat the person sitting next to us. He had shown her that the most powerful people are the ones who don't need a fortress at all. Vanessa pulls a small, silk scarf from her bag. She waits for Caleb to look her way, perhaps sensing her eyes on him. When he finally does, their eyes meet for a brief second in the dim light. Vanessa doesn't look away this time. She gives him a small, genuine, and humble nod. "I'm sorry," she mouths, her eyes wet with tears she hasn't shed in years. Caleb doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. He just gives a small, understanding nod back. He knows what it's like to be at the breaking point. He knows that everyone in this cabin, even the woman who screamed, is carrying a story that no one else can see. He knows that sometimes the loudest people are the ones who are the most broken inside. He looks at her with a level of empathy that makes Vanessa feel more seen than any business award ever could. The wheels touch the tarmac with a soft, rhythmic thud that vibrates through the cabin. The flight is over. The night is done. As the plane pulls into the gate, the passengers begin to stand. The sound of overhead bins opening and seatbelts clicking, filling the air. It is a return to reality, but the atmosphere in the business class cabin is different. It's quieter, more respectful. Vanessa waits. She stays in her seat, letting the long line of business travelers move past her. She watches as Caleb gently wakes Ivy. The little girl rubs her eyes, her face still pale and her hair a mess. But the panic from the beginning of the flight is gone. She looks at her dad, and for a second, she smiles. It is a small, flickering light in the darkness of her week. "We're home, buddy," Caleb whispers, his voice thick with relief. Caleb stands up, lifting Ivy into his arms as if she weighs nothing. As they move down the aisle, they have to pass Vanessa. She stands up, stopping them for a split second. She doesn't reach for her purse. She doesn't offer a business card. She doesn't offer money. She reaches out and gently, almost tentatively, touches Ivy's hand. "I'm sorry I was loud earlier, honey," Vanessa says, her voice soft, maternal, and real. "I hope you have a very peaceful sleep tonight, and I hope you always remember how much your daddy loves you. He's a very brave man." Ivy blinks at her, then looks at Caleb. Caleb gives her a small, encouraging nod. "Thank you," Ivy whispers, her voice like a small, silver bell. Caleb looks at Vanessa. He doesn't see a CEO anymore. He sees a woman who finally woke up. "We all have bad days, Miss Reed. I hope yours gets better. I really do. Thank you for the bulkhead." Vanessa watches them walk off the plane and into the brightly lit jet bridge. The jet bridge air was cold and carried the scent of jet fuel and damp pavement, a sharp contrast to the recirculated, luxury-scented air of the cabin. As Caleb walked ahead, his silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal, Vanessa felt a strange sensation. The loosening of a knot she hadn't realized was tied around her heart. The billionaire CEO stands in the empty cabin for a moment, the hum of the aircraft fading into the background. She feels the weight of the silence, but for the first time, it doesn't feel empty. She understands now. A seat, a title, a bank account, a corporate empire. They are all just numbers on a screen, shadows on a wall. The only true value, the only thing that actually matters when the lights go out, is the kindness we show in the moments when we have nothing left to give but our silence. She walks toward the baggage claim, not as a CEO, but as a daughter who needs to go home to her father. She decides to cancel her meetings for the week. She's going to the hospital, and she's not going to bring her laptop. The night is over. The sun is starting to rise over the runway in a blaze of orange and gold. And a single quiet sentence has changed the way she sees the world forever. She takes a deep breath. The air smells of a new beginning. And for the first time in years, Vanessa Reed isn't afraid of the silence. If you believe that kindness can start with just one small, quiet word, subscribe for more stories that reveal the heart beneath the power. And tell me in the comments, what would you say if you were shouted at in public for no reason?